Good morning, everyone. We'll get started here in a few minutes. We're still having folks join. Thanks for being here this morning, or today. Steve, wow.
Can you guys see me?
You persevered, yes, and we can hear you.
Somehow, when I finally got tech support on, they didn't do anything, but it worked.
No comment. Thanks for enduring.
That was like the 10th or 15th time. And
much
suddenly it
appreciated.
worked.
We've still got a couple minutes. Thanks everyone for joining. We'll get started in a few minutes. Steve, you may want to mute. I think it might be your speaker. Okay. If you would start identifying yourself in the chat box, where you're, what agency or organization you're affiliated with, and where you're located, whether it's in your kitchen, Lao, country and location would be appreciated. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. We'll wait just another minute or so. Great, let's go ahead and get started. For those of you still joining us, if you would go ahead and put your affiliation and location in the chat box. It's great to have you here. Good day or good evening. We're absolutely excited to convene this panel to launch a discussion to strategically address corruption-facilitated, environmental, and pollution-related transnational organized crimes. We want to thank our donor, INL. We want to thank all of you for participating and our panelists, all of whom are making this discussion possible. This topic is very timely given the stated priorities of the Biden administration: anti-corruption, national security, and climate change. And as with other community of practice meetings in the Nexus area, we're very focused in this discussion to hone in on practical solutions and strategies within the interagency universe. I want to just give you a little background on how we're going to run the discussion today. We're going to have about 30 minutes of facilitated round-robin Q&A questions and answers among our expert panelists, and then almost equal time for you all as participants to share your expertise, your questions, interventions, and ideas. All of that, please enter your questions or interventions via our chat box. Before we close, we'll again be using Mentimeter, which is our method of utilizing to gather your feedback from this meeting and to inform and improve our future activities. And again, for those of you that are just joining us, please identify yourselves in the chat box. And it's my absolute delight to now introduce Steve Wolfson. He's a senior attorney in the Office of General Counsel at the US EPA, and he's a huge friend and actual liaison with our JusTRAC program. And most relevant to today's events, he very proactively coordinates international capacity building activities on environmental law, including through the International Environmental Law Practice Group. Go ahead, Steve, and thanks very much.
Thanks so much, Mary, and sorry everybody for the noise. The lawnmower guy is here right now. Unfortunately, I'll mute in a minute. But I'm very happy to see my colleagues who I've been working with in JusTRAC over the years, and the community of practice in particular. For those of you that don't know me, I work in the EPA, Environmental Protection Agency, Office of General Counsel's International Law Group, and I'm the staff liaison to JusTRAC Plus from EPA. I have the honor to introduce the moderator for today's session. Milan Civic is the new Assistant General Counsel for International Law at the EPA Office of General Counsel. She came to EPA with a background in rule of law building, so I wanted to get her on board the JusTRAC Plus train. And so this is one of her first interagency events from her position at EPA. She previously served at the US State Department and at Department of Defense, where her work is focused on the rule of law, human rights, and environmental law and policy. Milan also served at the World Bank, Office of International Environmental Law, and she also worked overseas as a UN peacekeeper, overseeing support to countries emerging from armed conflict and working to build criminal justice and land reform legal systems. So take it away, Milan.
Thank you very much, Steve. And thank you, Mary, and I'm very, very pleased and thankful for ABA Raleigh to have organized this JusTRAC Plus webinar. No doubt those of you in the rule of law field have encountered JusTRAC's training and activities, as I have. ABA Raleigh is the plus, as you all know, in the JusTRAC Plus, and among the great advances that ABA Raleigh has brought to the JusTRAC family are the rule of law portal and the webinars, excuse me, such as this one today. The topic of this webinar is particularly timely, as Mary said, as environmental protection is among the issues at the forefront of the Biden-Harris administration. Among the first actions of this administration, as we know, was to re-enter the Paris Climate Agreement and more broadly, making clear that climate change and other environmental threats are priorities given the negative impacts on public health, the economy, and national security. Rule of law, including a legal framework of environmental laws, resource protection, and equitable access to a clean and healthy environment through legal enforcement and recourse to the justice system, are among these priorities. as the U.S. supports partner nations in strengthening their rule of law. The environmental rule of law framework is indeed a barometer for stability, security, and a thriving and sustainable economy. In fact, Interpol cites environmental crime as the fourth leading type of organized crime globally, often with links to fraud and corruption and convergence of human trafficking, drug and firearms trafficking, and money laundering. And indeed, I saw firsthand in West Africa how inequitable land use and overexploitation of natural resources was one of the underlying causes of the conflict. I'd like to introduce the discussants now, after which I'll pose a series of questions to this expert group. John Ostrike, Assistant Director for Investigations, Criminal Investigations Division, U.S. Environmental Protection Agency. Joseph Pooks, Deputy Chief, Environmental Crime Section, U.S. Department of Justice. And Mark Romley, Regional Resident Legal Advisor, Laos, Office of Overseas Prosecutorial Development, OPDAT, Assistance and Training. Oh, forgive me, I said that in the wrong order. But those of you who have worked with OPDAT, Overseas Prosecutorial Development Assistance and Training Group at the U.S. Department of Justice. Now I'm just going to plunge right into the questions, and I'd like to start with setting the stage. What constitutes an environmental crime?
Is my microphone working, Milan? Just to make sure I'm coming through.
Yes, indeed.
Excellent.
We can hear you. Go right ahead.
That might be a good thing or a bad thing. When I joined the department 20 years ago, environmental crime was strictly pollution.
Wait, Joe, let me stop you a sec. You're having an echo somehow. Do you possibly have the phone on and your...
I don't think so, but let me double check.
All right, then go right ahead. We'll deal with the echo. Go ahead, please.
Okay, apologize if I'm echoing for folks. Was just going to mention when I started, environmental crime strictly meant pollution. In the 20 years since I've been working in this job, it's come to include a lot more than just pollution. Generally speaking, biodiversity is another huge area that's impacted the environmental arena. And by biodiversity, I'm talking about your wildlife trafficking, your illegal timber trafficking, and illegal fishing, IUU fishing. In some ways, I think it's great that those areas are getting the proper attention. But I think one thing I've seen is at some point, the pollution aspect of environmental crime seems to have lagged behind in terms of public attention and focus, which I think has been troubling. And I very much appreciate the opportunity to participate in this meeting, because I think one of the objectives here is to shine that light back on pollution and the area, particularly with transboundary pollution and waste crime, which is, I think, an area that has a tremendous impact on human health and needs all the attention that it can, even though it might not be as we like to say in the business, as sexy as some of these other environmental areas.
Thanks very much. And just to build on what you said, what are some examples of transboundary pollution crime? Could any of the other experts expand on Joe's remarks, please?
Yeah, thanks, Milan. This is Mark. Prior to working for OPDAT, I worked in Joe's office in the environmental crime section. So I'm very familiar with wildlife crime as well as pollution crime. So I work over here in Southeast Asia, and I cover the all of ASEAN. So I think most of the crime types we're seeing over here, as far as pollution, are the smuggling of some kind of pollutant, whether that's household waste, hazardous waste, or even recycling that's coming over from more developed countries into countries that really don't want them to be here or be in their country. So the groups that are doing that are transnational criminal groups. And as countries have passed laws to keep these pollutants out of their countries, the transnational groups have not really even noticed and have continued just to bring again hazardous waste, household waste, and recycled waste into countries that would prefer not to have those things buried in their land.
Would any of the other panelists like to chime in? Justin, I believe you've worked in this area?
Yeah, Milan, I think Justin might have just dropped off. He was having some technical issues.
Got it.
And so
Thanks
when
so
he's
much.
back online, I'm sure he'll jump in.
All right, great. All right, with that, I'd like to get a bit more specific. Is there, would you say that there's a nexus between pollution crime and organized crime entities? And this is directed to the panelists. Are organized crime entities engaged in pollution crimes? When enforcement action is happening, how do crime entities respond or shift to other criminal activities? And what expanded knowledge do agencies need when investigating pollution crimes? One last question in this complex series of questions is, what are more common indicators of pollution crimes?
Happy to take the initial stab at that, Milan, if that's okay. And the
yes,
short
please.
answer to your first question is yes. They're definitely involved. I'm also chair of Interpol's Pollution Crime Working Group, which are one of the groups that put out that study that you mentioned about it being the fourth largest area of crime, or environmental crime being the fourth largest area out there. And I think that the short answer is that there's any opportunity for organized crime groups to make money at very low risk, and even if they're caught, very small punishment or penalties, they're going to take advantage of it. I think they look at waste as a commodity, much as they do with any other crime area, drugs, human trafficking. And even more so, I think they view it as an area of opportunity because enforcement in this area is, I won't say lax, but let's say is very challenging. Even domestically, it's a challenge in terms of having the investigative resources to detect the crime going on. And if you look at transboundary crime in this area, I'd say it's 100 times more difficult. As we all know, trying to coordinate even within our own country is a challenge. Trying to do it, across oceans with countries with the language issues, with various resources, is even more challenging. And so the organized crime groups view this as a tremendously lucrative area with almost little to no chance of getting caught. When we first started looking at this, for example, at Interpol, we had a conference and we invited law enforcement agencies from about 50 countries to come in. And the question was, is this a problem? And we all, think about organized crime being a problem in this area, but what's the concrete evidence? And we had 50 countries come in, and every one of those countries had examples of organized crime working in this space. We see the TV and the movies. It's probably not a shock to anyone, but when you see this evidence going from our colleagues in Ukraine, Eastern Europe, Asia, Africa, even here in the US, the evidence is everywhere. And as my colleagues like to say, if you haven't found evidence of it in your country, you're not looking for it. And I think we found that to be very true as we move down this road.
Joe, I'm going to ask you to focus in on one aspect of your remarks. Financial incentives, or lack thereof, for governments to be motivated or unmotivated to address environmental pollution-related crimes. Could you expand on your thoughts on those financial incentives? Do the countries have more to gain in the short term? Do the governments view themselves as having more to gain in the short term to look the other way with environmental pollution-related crimes?
I think so, yes, and I have to be cautious here because I have other USG colleagues on this call, so I will not be too critical. But I think in every country that's a challenge. If you start finding problems, you've got to fix them, and fixing them costs money. And if you can kick that can down the road, particularly in the area of waste crime, I think that's easier to do because if you find this, if you want to do things the right way, and we're seeing this with recycling, for example, which at the moment isn't at the top of the list of crime here in the U.S., but to do things the right way is very expensive, so it's easier not to. And I think in terms of particularly in the criminal area, enforcement in a lot of countries, I think there's a financial, and I think Mark's going to mention this in his remarks, there's a financial incentive, and when you're dealing with, natural resources, timber, fisheries, wildlife, that you get money back if you start detecting this crime. With waste, if you start detecting it, you're stuck with a whole bunch of waste that you then have to pay for. And so it creates a lot of disincentives to do things the right way or track down this crime.
Yes, and as you mentioned, Joe, Mark, I'm aware that you worked in this area on, do you have any observations regarding resources allotted to enforcing environmental crimes? And have you seen adequate staffing for newer agencies, for example?
No, and that's a good point you make about it being newer agencies. I'm most familiar, again, with Southeast Asia. And in my time here, it's clear that the ministries of environment versus the ministries of agriculture and forestry are much less funded. Part of that is what Joe was mentioning. They can't fund themselves by permit proceeds for legal wildlife trade or legal timber trade. The government has to come up with the money itself. So that is a big problem for them, because a lot of these countries don't have the additional money to devote to those efforts. Another big problem for the ministries of environment in the region is that they tend to be new compared to their Ministry of Agriculture and Forestry counterparts in the government. So in addition to being underfunded, they are also typically underpowered. They're not tied into the government structure in the way that the agriculture and forestry type agencies would be. So that also leads them to usually being only, if they are effective, they're typically only effective in the capital region or in the higher population regions of a country. And I think probably just from our common experience and common sense, you would know that polluters don't tend to go to the highest population areas to commit these crimes. They go to places that are already out of the way. So if you have all of the power concentrated in capitals or inside the cities where, all the enforcement agents concentrated in those places, you're going to get even less detection of these crimes.
Less detection, it's also easier to hide the crimes as well, I imagine.
Hey, this is JusTRAC. I ended up dropping off the computer and I'm back on the phone. And I do have one comment just to add in there.
Please do, Justin. Absolutely.
Thank you. Really the difference between the pollution crimes versus the wildlife and timber really comes down to, is it a commodity or a liability? And the timber and the wildlife are a commodity. They're something that you can buy and sell, whereas the pollution crimes typically are around waste that people don't want, and now you're going to have to pay to get rid of. So that's really the biggest differences we see. And so the motivations for the countries to actually want to detect this issue has really been a challenge, because once you detect it, now you got to figure out how you're going to remediate it, how you're going to take care of it. And that's where, sometimes with industries, it's cheaper to figure out other ways to dispose of that waste, other than the legitimate ways that are protective of human health and the environment.
Justin, thanks very much. It's a very useful observation, the commodity versus liability concept. As you all have been making your remarks, I've been thinking about the interrelationship with corruption. How would you all say that corruption factors into pollution crimes? For example, do crime entities or actors utilize corruption that already exists for other crimes, or do they develop different paths? And how effective are crime entities at avoiding financial sanctions and administrative penalties and enforcement efforts? It's already been mentioned that these crimes are often committed outside of high population centers, easier to hide. So please go ahead and comment on these questions, if you would.
I'll go first here, if that works.
Absolutely.
What we've seen with, particularly in the area of international organized crime, is they exploit the same avenues and the same networks that they use in other areas. For example, some of the intel that we have seen in some other countries, for example, there are networks that fund or help support terrorism, and involve smuggling goods and arms, and the same networks that work work for wildlife trafficking, work for waste trafficking. It's all a question. If you have an efficient network, you're going to use it for whatever can make you money. And so certainly see them using pre-existing networks. Now, there's always going to be an opportunity where there's new networks being created based on relationships in these other countries. So both new and old networks are being used.
Thanks very much. I appreciate those remarks, Joe. Mark, I'm going to direct this question to you, given your experience working in the field, and particularly in Southeast Asia. What would be your advice regarding diagnosing and designing effective forms of technical assistance? How can the toolkit, for example, created from the community of practice, be used to help in developing programs or projects to address pollution crimes? How about a diagnostic template or rule of law indicators? Please go right ahead.
Yeah, my major piece of advice, and I know those of you who are already designing programs follow this, but for people thinking about jumping into supporting these anti-pollution efforts abroad, my major piece of advice is to get to really understand not just the country that you're operating in, but because enforcement is a criminal law area, to really understand the legal system that you're going to work in.
Mm-hmm.
Anybody who's done training on trial work, for example, for lawyers abroad, you get abroad and you find out that most legal systems are not like ours. There are a lot of legal systems where the attorney is not the prosecutor is not the star of the show at court, the judge is. So if you go to a country like that and you teach trial skills, they're not going to react very well because it's not useful to them. Some people will react because it's fun, but ultimately you're not going to change the system. So again, you've got to be familiar, and it's got to be. I think to me, what I've learned over the last 3 years is you have to be familiar down to a very basic level of their legal system, because there will be features of their legal system that you have not thought of. An example of that is in Southeast Asia. Many of the countries here, if somebody admits the crime on the spot, then there's no further investigation. They just take the person's word. The case gets wrapped up, sent to court, or a ticket is written, and then that's the end of it. They never ask, well, who was this person working for? Who were they working with? Where were these wastes going? These questions never end up being asked. So understanding things like that, and again, I've been here for 3 years, so I've had some time to think of it. You can use tools like the diagnostic template, which was developed in this community of practice. And I did one for Southeast Asia, which is up on the screen, for pollution crimes, and my thoughts on pollution crimes tied to corruption crimes in the region. And honestly, that took me less than a day to do, just with the knowledge I've gathered in the last 3 years working on wildlife crimes. Just because they intersect, I have enough knowledge of the pollution crime to take a pretty good guess at what the problems are going to be when we start programming for anti-pollution crime trainings in the region. So again, if one person can do it with just what's gathered secondhand, you can imagine what you could do with this template with a full team. It wouldn't be a lot of work, and it would lead a team to have a common starting point, a common reference point as programs proceed, and a pretty good indication of what the ending point would be.
Among the important points you're raising, you bring up the important point of the need and usefulness of tools such as these versus the importance of tailoring advice and programs to the specific country situation. I can say, as somebody who spent much of my career in Washington on the policy side and contributing to some of these tools, you gain an entirely different perspective when you've lived a number of years in a country and seen how critical the tailoring element is. The tools are necessary but not sufficient, but they're an awfully important starting point. In addition to tools, what specific strategies and resources exist or need to exist if they don't? For example, more financial analysts, broaden expertise in investigative teams, inspector training in ports, Interpol responses, and also how have we coordinated with allies such as Canada and the Brits?
Well, Milan, I'd say two sort of answers to that question. One, on a more, I guess, grassroots level, more training, and I hate to use the term capacity building, but that's what it is, for the frontline inspectors and the enforcement officials on what to look for and how to detect it. We've done a bunch of this both through my DOJ role and my Interpol role. We've done training over in Ukraine, Indonesia, Kenya, here in the US as well. We always have a lot to learn here as well. But just teaching people what to look for. I mean, that pollution crime is challenging. If you find guns or drugs, in a lot of cases, you know what you're finding. A lot of times when you find the illegal waste, you're not sure what it is. You're not sure if it's illegal or something that you should care about. And I'll give one example that I know Justin's folks with EPA have been focusing on. For example, on the southern border in California, there was an issue with illegal pesticides being brought in from Mexico to help, on public marijuana grows in the state and federal parks in northern and eastern California. And in the beginning, we were talking to the Customs and Border Protection folks, and they said, well, we haven't seen any evidence of this pesticide coming in, but we don't really know what we're looking for. So we went down there and provided them with training, and EPA trained all their inspectors. And I think we now have 40 open cases down in the border for something that no one thought was a problem in the first place. So that kind of frontline training, I think, is very helpful. I think you'll find most of the enforcement folks are receptive to being told, this is what you should be looking for, and being given those tools. I would say on a more strategic level, what we've seen in a lot of other countries is the use of intelligence to be more strategic about how we attack this problem of organized crime. Pollution crime is difficult. It's essentially white collar crime with a lot of science thrown in. So it's not something that's necessarily going to be intuitive. My colleagues in the UK and Scotland in particular, for example, had an experiment where their EPA grabbed a list of all their permit holders who were licensed to transport and dispose of hazardous waste, took it to the Police Scotland colleagues who ran it through their organized crime database and did some crime mapping. And they thought they might find, one or two people that had connections to organized crime. The first time they did a scrub of that information, they found 50% of the people who had waste licenses in Scotland had some connection to organized crime. And these are people that were not on anybody's radar until they did that. My colleagues in Canada have done something similar. And so looking at new ways to make these connections and discover these, relationships. And a lot of times it's somebody's wife has the permit, for example, but you don't know that the husband is connected to organized crime unless you look at it. And so I think as these techniques are coming into play, we're going to be a lot more effective at ferreting this out. And then the last thing I would say is, as I mentioned, there's a white collar crime element to this. Most pollution investigation units are good at finding pollution or the environmental side. They typically don't have a financial analyst with them as part of the team. And I think Mark alluded to this before, but if you don't have the people that can follow the money, you're going to be stuck with like the lower level mopes. You're never going to get to the, Mr. or Mrs. Big at the top of the organization. So adding financial expertise to these groups from the beginning, not just after the fact, I think makes for much more effective investigations.
Very, very.
And I would add on just for a minute on Joe's comments, which is, as we were talking earlier about the smuggling routes, and this feeds into this too, is where we have agencies that have specific missions, such as CBP involving border protection, spending the time to build that capacity and teach them what our equities are in these enforcement areas is important, because, or even DEA or or FBI, when we're looking at human smuggling, they may stop a truck coming through a smuggling route, and it may not have the human cargo they expected, but it may have a whole bunch of drums on the back of it. And they may stop at the fact that, okay, it's not what we're looking for, when indeed it may be one of these liabilities that are being shipped across the borders. So being able to really educate our enforcement partners, both domestically and internationally, helps build our capacity. And I would add in also on the white collar side of it, helping some of these organizations such as IRS that spend a lot of time doing financial analysis, understand how these environmental enterprises work and where they make their money, to help them understand better to what does a potential criminal organization look like versus a legitimate one. So a lot of opportunities we have here to build capacity, increase our site picture, and do a lot of good work.
Great, great. I think this would be an excellent time to take some questions from the participants, from our guests here at this webinar. So I'd like to open up to questions. As Mary said, please put your questions in the chat, and then Mary will help triage the questions. Mary, do we have any questions in the chat already?
Milan, thanks. I think folks are starting to put their questions in. If I could just make an observation, and I want to thank our panelists. Mark's reference to our diagnostic template, we welcomed his expertise. The toolkit was intended to be of assistance to people that are trying to design and implement technical assistance. And especially in this area, which is our panelists have observed is not as familiar of an area of transnational organized crime. I hope that the template and other tools or other resources that have been identified through the toolkit will be of assistance. What Mark did was walked through a set of inquiries that were designed by our expert, Peter Ritchie, to try to kind of identify what's going on in general terms, and then what pieces might be appropriate to kind of pull off, or a digestible bite, as I like to say, and then could turn that into kind of an idea for a program and help you design a NOFO, and in the end, design some technical assistance. And the other point I appreciate from the panelists is this is a type of transnational organized crime similar to what many of our participants are already working on. And so, the more that we can share some of the tools and ideas that already some of us are utilizing, it's most welcome. So thank you.
Thank you, Mary. Thank you very much. Are there any questions in the chat that we'd like to start with?
One, Milan, Patricia has asked at the ICTR, the Tribunal for Rwanda, we investigated the fundings of arms brought into Rwanda and that were used in genocide. The forensic accountant we employed was critical to our success. So an observation and maybe a little more information. I'd be curious too, and thanks, Patricia, specifically in the area of financial flows and the use of financial analysts. What are you all thinking in terms of technical assistance? I also know we have colleagues from Treasury participating. I'd love any of their interventions as well.
Absolutely. Not just the discussants, but anybody who's online now, please jump right in.
Yes, hi, this is Joe Berg from the Office of Technical Assistance, and I've been actually trying to focus on the financial flows, primarily as it relates to countries where we have ongoing projects in Africa. And so of the three primary areas that have come up are the illegal wildlife trafficking, illegal logging, as well as illicit mining, specifically gold mining. And so one of the things that we're doing is building capacity within the financial intelligence units so that they have the ability to actually follow the money trail as what has been brought up before. One of the first steps that will be instrumental is actually forming these smaller, if you will, task force. That one of the biggest problems we see that occurs is the lack of communication between the police, the financial intelligence unit, as well as some of the prosecutors. And so by getting everyone at the same table, we think that will provide benefits going forward and serve as models of cooperation for other entities. So that's our focus there. Thank you.
Great. Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Hi,
everyone.
Go ahead.
with Treasury. Can folks hear me?
Yes.
Great. Sorry, I had to call in because Google Meet does not work on my computer. So glad y'all can hear me. So I just want to kind of echo what Joe is saying. I think that's exactly right. I think one of the biggest things, and I do want to raise everyone's attention. Hopefully, very soon we will have a report by the Financial Action Task Force on money laundering and environmental crimes, which includes illegal mining, illegal logging, and waste trafficking. There was already a report last year on wildlife trafficking, which has a lot of recommendations. So I think when it comes to technical assistance, starting there and looking at those recommendations, because that's what we need countries to focus on and do. And Joe's exactly right. It's really getting domestic coordination and cooperation and expertise on these areas to really focus on the finance angle, as well as bringing in more competent authorities outside of the financial intelligence unit. Unlike the United States, where our financial intelligence unit is also a regulatory supervisor over the financial industry, in most countries it's not the case. In many countries, the FIU is actually a part of law enforcement, which in some cases can make it easier when it comes to building capacity in investigations. In many countries, the FIU is actually just performs the basic functions of an FIU, which is receipt, analysis, and distribution of financial intelligence information to competent authorities, including law enforcement and supervisors. I think one other area is building the capacity and expertise of the supervisory agencies as well, that are regulating financial entities, including, your traditional financial entities like depository institutions and banks, but also designated non-financial businesses and professions, which includes dealers in precious metals, stones, and jewels, which we all know have and play a huge role, particularly when it comes to illegal mining and the commodities that come out of that. I think it's really important to bring those parts of the sector on board as well, because an FIU can have the capacity to be able to analyze information, but they need the information. A lot of the information is going to come from the reporting from financial institutions and designated non-financial institutions. So we really need to build up the expertise and capacity of industry to be able to identify and report this information, so then it can go to competent authorities, so then they can use it for investigations. And we really see public-private partnerships in this area being a space to do that, where you work with the financial industry as well as civil society organizations and NGOs on the ground that can help financial regulators and other competent authorities in government really understand kind of what's happening, to be able to shape that out, build out kind of typologies and methodologies, which that's when really law enforcement comes in to help show, hey, this is what we're also seeing. So bringing all that information together to then put out something like an advisory, for example, or guidance to the financial industry on, here's the methods that are being used, here's how the financial system is being used, here's how you can spot suspicious activity. So then that can help generate more quality reporting. So then that can be utilized by law enforcement to be able to have that information to take better investigations that lead to better prosecutions and bringing in that illicit finance angle. So I think you'll see a lot of great recommendations in the FATF wildlife tracking report that came out almost a year ago now. And you'll see a lot that'll be coming out hopefully soon on the environmental crimes report that I think can be utilized and turned into areas where we could use some more capacity building. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I see in the chat that Judith asked if Mark could perhaps talk a bit more about how you completed the template, how it's helped you clarify the issue set, and in particular how a program officer supporting bilateral foreign assistance would begin. What would be the steps and how to draw the connections between this tool and other tools that are available, as well as this crime and other crimes.
Yeah, so I was a bit fortunate in grabbing this task just because, again, my background is as an environmental crimes prosecutor. So I've been working in the area in Southeast Asia since about 2014. So I had 6 years of meetings with environmental related agencies and ministries where I've just been hearing things, and writing them down. So for me, for this exercise anyway, it was just a matter of going back and finding that information. But obviously for somebody in an agency abroad or at an embassy, you would have to go out and have those meetings yourself. So again, for this one, it was done in a matter of 2 weeks. I can't imagine usually you would try to do that in a matter of 2 weeks, but I was lucky to have that information on hand. And I was luckily enough to have Peter Ritchie to speak to talk, because he's from Australia and he's familiar with Southeast Asia. So he and I just spoke and kind of figured out we triangulated the same connections we're seeing to corruption, for example. And then I just laid my knowledge of the environmental pollution crimes that are happening in the region on top of his knowledge, deep knowledge of the corruption problems in the area. So you could go about it one of two ways. If you wanted to be somebody starting from the ground up, you would have to go have all the meetings. And I've been meeting with people from every environmental ministry in ASEAN for 6 years, on and off. Or you would have to have somebody go out and do those meetings over a period of time. And again, that could be an ESTH officer, or some of the bigger agencies and embassies may have other officers who can handle those tasks. But when you think of a topic like solve environmental pollution in Southeast Asia, it's overwhelming. But what Peter's toolkit had was they're very simple questions, deceivingly simple at first. And once you start thinking through those questions that he's thought of and put in this toolkit, it starts springing other ideas. And then that connects to this. And those two things connect to another thing. And by the end, you read it. And like I said, I was very surprised at the end that it came through as something cohesive rather than just a bunch of random thoughts. So
Thanks.
It took years worth of knowledge that I'd gathered and connected into 1 2-page document.
Very good points, Mark. And this particular template and other such tools are useful for a programming officer to gain clarity and to focus attention on the most important objectives. But they're also, I've found, useful for as questionnaires of sorts to get the host country government and civil society leaders thinking about these issues and be able to organize their thoughts on the type of assistance that would be best useful, and going back to the tailoring of the assistance to their particular country situation. So yes, these tools are extremely useful on a practical level.
And Milan, can I just jump in here for 1 second?
Please do.
Apologize. I'd be remiss with my OPTAD and INL colleagues on the line here, just not to make this plug. I got to tell you, being worked in this space internationally for a couple of years, the number one reaction I get when I talk to folks at the embassy in a particular country or elsewhere in the U.S. government is, well, we knew wildlife trafficking was a problem here. We knew timber was a problem. We didn't know illegal waste trade was a problem here. We didn't know. And so part of our job has been to sort of raise the profile on that. I can tell you with our Interpol work, there's not a week that goes by that we don't get a request from a country, hey, can you provide us some help or some capacity building here, which leads to then my reaching out. So I would just say the folks that are dealing in other countries, if you don't know them, I can get you names, but I guarantee that there are people in your country that are looking for U.S. assistance in this area. And are desperate for it. And it just is, for some reason, not gotten the same high profile that some of these other environmental crimes do. I mean, I go to environmental conferences now where pollution is even mentioned, which is kind of amazing when you consider the long-term health impacts here. But if there's a chance in whatever space you're working in other countries to identify who the pollution people are, I guarantee you they're going to be like sponges. They're going to be very eager for whatever assistance is out there, because in terms of resources, it's probably the most underfunded or undersupported part of our environmental crimes program.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
And because of what Mark said earlier, in the fact that most of the environmental enforcement agencies abroad are very young in comparison to their other resource partners, they really are they might be the founding members. So they're really trying to figure out what it's going to look like for their country and for their folks. So they're definitely looking for resources right now.
And they also may not be the type of government personnel who normally are invited to the types of meetings where the government is speaking with the donor countries, with the supporting countries. So it's quite a dilemma that's set up, and it'll be very useful to help direct people to the right agencies in these countries asking for support.
Yeah, that's a great point.
Absolutely.
Milan, can I ask a question of our panelists and our participants? You know, on the topic of investigative skills, what is your perception about, you know, targeted agencies to target? You know, we've heard that some of the environmentally geared agencies are understaffed, under-resourced, and lack the technical expertise. But what about other investigative agencies or functions, whether it's border, customs? What other opportunities do you see for technical assistance on the investigative side? And our panelists or participants?
I don't know if this is an appropriate story. I don't want to hog the microphone here, but just one example we had, again, with my Scottish colleagues. In Scotland, there's a tax, that a landfill tax, and you're supposed to pay it every time you dump in the landfills. And they're having a problem with the illegal, you know, dumping in landfills. Well, the tax department, their version of the IRS, found out about it, and it was explained to them that they were losing revenue. And then at that point, suddenly it became a commodity, so to speak, that the tax revenue, and their tax division then funded and sent a bunch of accountants to be co-located with their environmental protection folks to look at this and do the financial analysis. So what we've seen in some countries, if you can persuade another agency that there is money to be made, or it is a commodity, that you can then get the financial investigative resources assigned. Now, that's not going to be applicable in every country, but trying to, you know, have an incentive for the other agencies to get involved, to maybe keep a part of the proceeds they recover, has been one effective technique that we've seen.
And I'm thinking also, based on my field experience, that having border agents, border police involved is very important. However, I would emphasize the training and awareness side of it for border police, rather than asking them to do the direct intervention of law enforcement on environmental and pollution crimes in particular. It may be too broad and really requires a certain level of technical and expert awareness. But there's certainly a role for border police.
Just had Jeff interjected, the Attorney General's office is logical, you know, including in our own country where a lot of environmental enforcement and investigative action happens. We have a question from Joan Margaret for our panelists. How do you gather or identify data from the field and to monitor and evaluate efforts in this area? Huge challenge, I know, generally in technical assistance, but in this area in particular, I would assume it's a pretty tall challenge. Any observations or comments?
I would say when it comes to imports, exports, we spend a lot of time partnering with EPA, spends time partnering with CBP, with their National Targeting Center, also with their Commercial Trade Targeting Center, to identify products, violative products that may be coming into the country, and also other unusual patterns that may be indicative of illegal conduct, and then begin to develop strategies with them on ways to interdict, prevent it from coming in, and identify the individuals that may be involved. But really, it's forming these key strategic relationships and partnerships before they're necessarily providing you a benefit, and talking to them about what your equities are, understanding what their roles are, what their data systems are, in order to really come to a single-minded approach about how to leverage those resources in a way that you can begin to detect the conduct that you're looking for. And sometimes you don't necessarily, when you start these relationships, even really know what you're looking for yet, until you begin to really understand what data systems exist, how they collect the data, and what their roles are in the regulatory processes. So just the basic level is forming that relationship and beginning to work together towards the common goal.
Do others, whether it's discussants or participants, have any comments on this monitoring evaluation question? Is that certainly is a very important question, and something that stumps many of us who when you're working in the field.
I would just echo on or follow up on Justin's comments. Big data is, I think, the wave of the future in this. These crimes are getting more sophisticated and spanning the globe, and it's sometimes trying to find a needle in a haystack. And so being able to first get the data, know what you're looking at, and then do something with it is a tremendous challenge. And again, it's bringing other areas, traditional intelligence analysis that maybe wasn't part of the day-to-day law enforcement, 20, 30 years ago, but bringing that capacity to bear to look at this is going to be essential, I think, if we're going to make a dent in this area.
Thank you. Do you have any other questions?
Milan, I have a question, and also Steve has asked us, we want to make sure to mention that the template that was completed by Mark will be circulated after the meeting, but to also remind folks that a blank template exists within the toolkit that's on the knowledge portal. And there's also another completed template in the knowledge portal, or in the toolkit that actually sets out 3 or 4 types of transnational crimes, and then flows through the list of questions, and we've gotten positive feedback on those. My question, unless there's another one in the chat box, I'm curious to know, especially Joe and Mark, what do you tell prosecutors in terms of helping manage expectations? Transnational organized crime, we already know, is hard to identify, interrupt, and certainly hard to investigate and prosecute. But in the sense that we're understanding that pollution-related crimes occur in the context of other types of transnational organized crimes, do you help prosecutors in terms of their, not only the actual prosecution of the accused, but do you kind of help them strategize in terms of interrupting the activity in conjunction with the actual prosecution? I just think that a lot of prosecutors we've worked with, you just never get to the prosecution because it's too complicated transnationally. Just curious to know kind of what your advice is on strategizing.
Yeah, Mary, that's a great question. It's a hard one to answer, actually. Part of both in my work with pollution and wildlife crime, that has been one of the major obstacles to getting to the point of advising and forming relationships with prosecutors, is that they feel that the investigators are not doing a good enough job yet. So in wildlife, that's sometimes can be questionable. I don't understand where they're coming from. This big pointy white thing, yeah, that's an ivory. What do you mean it's not? But with pollution, it's like Joe was saying earlier, sometimes you don't know what the pollutant is. Sometimes it's leached into the ground, and the only way you know it's there is because everything is dead around it. And so part of, I guess, the skills that prosecutors, or not prosecutors even, but investigators would need in these kind of regions is first to understand that that's an indication that there's a problem. Fish kills, dead grass, random things catching on fire, smoke coming out of the earth. These are all indications there might be a pollutant. Just teaching investigators things like that, and then arming them with just enough scientific and technical skill so that they know how to identify it. So there's some, for example, with acidic or basic wastes. So super high pH or super low pH. They're very simple little strips that can tell you which it is. And if a pollution regime is set up like ours is, just testing something to be too basic or too acidic could set you into the area where you're dealing with a crime and not just random pollution. So there's some simple things I think we could do to help investigators. And then for prosecutors, I mean, absolutely, particularly with OPDAT, that's one of the things we try to do, is to get to that point where we are thinking strategically with them. Okay, so the cops aren't giving you good cases. How can we help them? And how can we help them do their job better? Can we push guidance down from the prosecutor level to the investigator level? Those are all things we try to do. Like I said, it's with varying degrees of success because things like drugs, trafficking in persons, etc., come up, and everybody runs off to pay attention to those for a while. But it is definitely something we want to do.
I just jump on. I would say, having done a lot of this training overseas and somewhat domestically as well, other countries, I think, generally have a different model than we have here in the U.S. with prosecutors. It might be a model Justin would prefer, where the prosecutors stay out of the investigator's lane until the investigation is complete. But what we've seen in other countries, when we're doing this capacity building, it's essential, I think, to get the prosecutors in the room from the beginning, because nothing's more deflating to an investigator than to have done a lot of work and then have a prosecutor at the end say, well, this is too hard, this is too difficult, I'm not going to do it. And in a lot of countries, they don't have a dedicated environmental prosecution unit. You might have someone who's a line prosecutor, has got 20 cases on his or her desk that are all easier than this complicated pollution fraud case. And so having them in the room, getting them buy-in, and prosecutors always ask, is there any crime there? How hard is this going to be? And will I get my name in a press release at the end? Those are usually the motivating factors for a lot of prosecutors. So when you have them in early, you kind of get buy-in, and it's kind of hard to say I'm not taking your case when you've been working with the investigator for a year or two. And so I would just say, as far as any training or capacity building, I don't see it often enough, but I think prosecutors need to be in that room as well.
That's great advice. Absolutely. Particularly, as you mentioned, a lot of the countries we're seeking to support have different legal systems, different players, and sometimes the prosecutors are underfunded as well. So getting them involved in the process from the get-go is very important. Mm-hmm. Mary, I think that folks might like to hear a bit more about the knowledge portal that you mentioned. Certainly, many of us on this webinar are familiar with it, but for those who aren't, or for any advances, any changes, additions that you made to the portal, please go ahead and speak about it.
Music to my ears, Milan. Thank you. I'll give a little more information about the knowledge portal, and then JJ's asked another question. But thanks for that question. The knowledge portal houses a selection of curated resources, which we hope to enlarge, as this discussion is carried forward on this particular topic within the Nexus area, as well as other resources. We also have a discussion board, and we'll be posting at least one discussion question after this webinar is over, to try to kind of spark and continue the discussion. Because as I've had the pleasure to work with these panelists, excuse me, I realized that this is really the first of many conversations that we hope will occur, and many of them virtually within the knowledge portal. I guess the other observation I would have is that I think one of the other features of the knowledge portal is the time that colleagues within Rowley have spent kind of virtualizing the toolkit and the practice note, which makes it, to me, incredibly user-friendly. Once you kind of get into the practice note, which we've talked in other meetings before, it kind of mirrors the progress of a technical assistance strategy where you look at the problem, you diagnose the issue, then you move into design and implementation, and
Anything interesting?
the monitoring and evaluation. So that becomes a virtual experience in the knowledge portal. If you're more focused now on diagnosing an issue, whether it's through the use of the template or other tools identified in the practice note, you know, I find it, I'm biased, but I find it to be an easier experience than just reading a downloaded PDF of a practice note. Milan, let me get back to JJ's questions. Can the panelists speak to whether there are geographic hotspots? Good question. Where this is a particularly egregious problem, and where do we see the most talk involvement in these crimes?
I was busy typing an answer. Now it's all, so I apologize. I won't hit send then. What I was saying was I think what we're seeing is Southeast Asia and certain African countries. The problem has gotten worse recently. As folks know, China, for example, a country that used to take most of the world's waste, shut its doors a couple years ago, said we're not doing that anymore. And that's created a big problem in terms of where to send the waste. And we've seen it go downstream in Southeast Asia, and then more and more countries are closing their doors. I think I saw something yesterday that Turkey was going to shut its doors. And so that's created a market. I mean, you're going to keep producing waste, that you can't stop that. So it's got to go somewhere. I'm not sure where all the waste that was going to China is going now, but we know some of it's being illegally sent to Africa and Southeast Asia. And I'd also mention the recent Basel amendments that have shut down the ability to legally send waste to most places in the world, particularly from Europe, for example. We're seeing markets in Eastern Europe spring up, as well as Southeast Asia and Africa, which the problem's just going to get worse as the waste piles up, and the amendments prohibit traditionally ways you used to traditionally dispose of the waste. So I'm not sure what parts of the globe I've left out in that answer, but I would that would be my answer.
Joe, would you say that it's trending more and more toward the most underdeveloped, the least wealthy countries to be receiving the waste?
Absolutely, and not just the least developed, the countries that have the least capacity to manage it. They don't have a recycling program to handle the waste. And so what we're seeing is, for example, it comes from the US, goes over to Malaysia or Indonesia, and ends up back in the ocean. And you know, because it's just easier, and it's in the short term easy money. It's like, sure, send your waste here, we'll take care of it, and then dump it. And long term, obviously, it's a terrible business model. But I think it's the most under privileged and least recyclable or manageable countries that are getting this 100%.
So that says to me that it's also an environmental justice, environmental issue as well, which overlaps with human rights issues and
100%.
And absolutely. And you also raised another point of processing the waste. To what extent is our technological advances part of the solution for enforcement of against environmental crimes?
Well, I think there's that's a complex question to which I don't have a simple answer, but I would say that we have the technology there to handle a lot of this waste, but it's not cheap. And particularly here in the US, what we're seeing is it's just cheaper to make more plastic and then, you know, dump the stuff in the landfills. And you don't have to, you just read the paper and you see cities and states here in the US are basically closing down their recycling programs because it's too expensive. No one wants to pay the extra taxes. So we have technology to do it. But another consequence of this illegal waste trade, for example, is that you're cutting off the incentive for companies to set up this infrastructure. And not to get into the whole circular economy discussion, but if we're not enforcing this, we're giving them sort of an off-ramp to take a cheaper way out here. And so I think we have technology, but until we get a handle on the illegal shipments of this waste, there's not going to be an incentive for people to do things the right way.
So the technology exists, but the financial incentive is there. Somebody has to pay for it. and that enforcement cycle is a very important part of this equation. Thank you. Mary, I turn it back to you.
Thank you, Milan. If I may, I'm going to go ahead and thank our panelists. The time, the expertise, in addition to very busy duties, is much appreciated. As my colleague John Gates puts up the Mentimeter survey, again, we depend on your feedback to inform our future activities. Please take your time going through the survey. There are a few questions to be answered, and you're welcome to continue to address those after the end of the session. In addition to the panelists, and I also want to include Steve and Milan for moving this discussion forward. Your time is much appreciated. And also to JJ and our INL colleagues, want to thank all of our participants, those that are still with us and have had to jump off. And a special thank you to my Rowley colleagues. You know, putting on these discussions takes a lot of hands and energy and time. It's much, much appreciated. And finally, as I mentioned before, please, if you haven't already, sign up for our knowledge portal. It's just a processing of click into the portal and get your account set up, and then you have access to all these resources and the toolkit that I've described. And again, my final ask is that we want this very much to be the beginning of the discussion. And, you know, it's an area that we understand is much more deserving of more targeted attention, resources, and technical assistance. So let's use this as a launching point for that to happen. And thank you very much, everyone, and have a good rest of your day or evening.
Thank you. Right.
Mary, I see we still have some folks on the line with us, but hi, Mary Margaret. Good to see you. I was curious to hear folks' thoughts. And Joe, thank you for all your contributions to the conversation and to helping raise our awareness of this issue. I think it's really interesting because it's complicated, right? And it's an area that doesn't have, I think, enough attention, but also, you know, as you mentioned, is significantly under-resourced. And so, you know, anytime you're trying to shift resources, it's an uphill climb, but it's good for folks to be attuned to the issue and, you know, alerted to, you know, why it matters where they're working.
Oh, that's great. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. I don't know if there's any others who stayed on that wanted to comment, but.
Thanks, JJ, for the feedback. I think Justin's had to drop off. We may have to have a debrief at another time. And Mark might have gone to bed. Was hoping to get, you know, a little more feedback, but I'd love to, you know, talk more to our panel about kind of some next steps. And also, you know, I was pleased that there was some, you know, the more I've delved into the issue, I see the similarities and I see the overlaps in technical assistance opportunities, you know. So it
Mark's back.
Timely discussion.
All right, well, I will then go ahead and take my leave so folks can head to bed. But thanks again. And I know we have a few others who are remaining on the line. So don't know if they wanted to ask anything of any particular questions. But if not, I will take my leave.
Thanks, JJ.
Thanks,
Thank
JJ.
you, everyone.
Thanks, everyone. Okay.
Let's see. And okay, we do have Mark still on. Sorry, I was looking at the list of names.